Okay, in a normal human being, food is brought down the esophagus, digested in the stomach, and then enters large intestine. In the large intestine, glucose enters the bloodstream and is carried throughout the body. Once glucose molecules reach the pancreas, they are carried across the cell membrane by the GLUT2 protein. And the glucose molecules in the pancreas target the beta cells and the islet of Langerhans, which are the light blue, to produce the hormone insulin. Insulin is then injected into the bloodstream where it travels to cells that have a specific receptor on the cell membrane. So, with diabetes. Diabetes mellitus is a chronic disease in which the target cells with insulin receptors have become resistant to the insulin signal, or the pancreas does not produce enough insulin to maintain glucose levels. This is known as type 2 diabetes or adult diabetes and can result in hyperglycemia and other serious health problems and accounts for 95% of diabetic cases. Another form of diabetes is type 1 diabetes or juvenile diabetes. This form of diabetes accounts for roughly 5% of diabetic cases and it occurs when the body attacks the beta cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. Thus, type 1 diabetes can be classified as a type of autoimmune disorder. In the following animation, you will see how insulin works normally and how different factors can affect the ability for the body to regulate glucose levels with insulin.
This is the insulin pathway. First, the CAPN10 protein breaks down fats. Then, insulin is received correctly by its transmembrane protein. This protein is known as the ENPP1, which transports the insulin into the cell. The insulin then binds to the IRS protein, which carries the attached molecule to the GLUT4 protein. Once the insulin activates the GLUT4 protein, glucose binds to its outer surface and then can be transported across the membrane. An influx of glucose molecules on the intracellular side of the cell produce glycogen, or animal fat, which is stored in the liver of mammals and can be converted to energy. Sometimes, things can go wrong in this process where insulin cannot be recepted correctly by its protein. For example, the ENPP1 receptor protein may become disfigured because of extreme temperature or pH changes that can denature it. When this happens, insulin cannot bind to the outside receptor and therefore cannot signal for the opening of the GLUT4 channel to let glucose in. Thus, a buildup of glucose and insulin occur in the extracellular space. Another mutation in this process can also result in the ineffectiveness of insulin pathways. Sometimes insulin binds correctly to the ENPP1 protein and is brought inside the cell, but it is the IRS protein that malfunctions. When this happens, the IRS protein is not activated, and therefore the GLUT4 protein does not receive the signal to let glucose in. However, sometimes the GLUT4 channel itself is the faulty device in this process. In this case, insulin is received correctly by both the ENPP1 and the IRS proteins, but the signal is not received correctly by the GLUT4 because of its change in shape. When this occurs, everything else in the process is working correctly, but the GLUT4 is unable to open the channel for the glucose to come into the cell. Last but not least, a default in the CAPN10 protein that breaks down fat molecules can become overwhelmed by fat or cease to stop working. If this happens, the fat molecules can surround the receptor proteins and the insulin and glucose cannot react properly with their proteins. This is a significant part of diabetes where a common characteristic is a gross excess of fat or obesity.
Diabetes, its effects and direction of study. Normally, insulin binds to the insulin receptor and regulates the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. In addition, it initiates the polymerization of triglycerides and proteins in muscle and adipose tissues. In an organism with diabetes, mutations occur in the insulin receptor protein or the transduction pathway, which result in the buildup of glucose in the bloodstream. Also, proteins and triglycerides made by insulin will not be signaled for production by insulin. When insulin works correctly, organisms have the ability to heal themselves quickly and fight off infection. They also have energy that is converted by cells through aerobic respiration. Symptoms of diabetes are as follows: excessive or frequent need to urinate, blurred vision, and an inability to heal wounds efficiently or fight off infection. which is due to the lack of oxygen being produced by the mitochondria in the cells, so the tissues do not receive oxygen and die. Lethargy, which occurs because there is no glucose being used in aerobic respiration, unquenchable thirst, insatiable hunger, and blood vessels contract because glucose clogs the blood vessels, which leads to heart problems and the amputation of limbs. Different types of drugs are being experimented with that restrict the amount of glucose lost in urination. Temporary drugs are being developed with GLP-1 agonists, which is a naturally present hormone that signals for the secretion of insulin and lets the brain notice when eating. Patients get injections of this type of drug weekly, but more permanent solutions are being developed. New methods for detecting and treating diabetes are also being introduced, mainly screening. Those with conditions that are often present in diabetics will be screened to prevent further